arisen from the CR review of WebRTC PC. We don't have any media capture issues for today. And as usual, we'll try to get an editor's draft out following the meeting. So the CR review completed on May 31st. 107 new issues were filed. So everyone's been very busy, and thank you for all those issues. We're going to try to target some issue clusters and related areas today, and hoping we can get some direction on those. We are continuing to solicit feedback from implementers on features not on their radar for implementation. I think we've gotten most of that, but there is one thing left on the agenda for today. About the virtual meeting, if you're here, you probably got the basic info and also know how to get to the tip of the tree drafts. We do have a link to these slides on the wiki. I guess you'll be the scribe, Stefan?
Yeah, I'm scribe.
Do we need another one?
I will take the notes in a separate document and send it to Vivian and you Bernard afterwards for reviewing.
Okay. So I guess we're okay for the scribing, and we are recording this meeting. Hopefully, I'm not recording it. Somebody is. Okay. For discussion today, we've got topics on relating to tracks and track removal, stuff like that. The data channel, DTLS certs and algorithms, and then objects and a few miscellaneous things. Hopefully we can get through all of this, but we'll see. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Taylor now, who's going to deal with 3 issues relating to tracks.
All right, so can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. So this cluster of issues is basically we need to figure out how tracks relate between the sender and the receiver. At some point, there is a symmetry where if you call add track on one side, the track appears on the other side. If you call remove track, the track is removed on the other side. But with the introduction of transceivers and early media and the last major pivot to the API, this doesn't occur anymore because a remotely received track basically corresponds to everything received from a specific RTB sender, which could be multiple tracks on the sender side. And if you remove a track on the sender side, media can still be received later, so it doesn't end the track on the receiver side anymore, or remove it. And so, as mentioned, the bullet here, section 5.1 says that when you remove a track, the ended event should fire on the other side. But I believe this is just leftover text, and I don't see any reference to where the event is actually fired. And section 5.3 talks about the immediate event being fired when RTP timeout occurs. But this is different than the immediate event that you would get previously after a new round of signaling. So as I understand it right now, the only thing that happens if you call remove track and do a new round of signaling on the remote side is that the transceiver's direction changes. And so the question is this acceptable, or do we need to keep the the track-based abstraction working and have some indication on the remote side when a track is removed on the other side?
So this is John. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Taylor.
I go on. Your blog post was very useful in explaining how we got here and what the gaps are. So I appreciate any feedback you have.
Yeah, basically. So I think what is in the spec right now would be quite a breaking change because both Chrome and Firefox today use add stream, and that fires ended on a remote track, so that would stop working by the end of the year if we implemented the spec. And also for Firefox, you can also use add track, and it fires track and the ended event for add and remove basically, and even Chrome does if you use adapter.js. So I see an established pattern already that I think could lead to web compat if we stopped firing ended. And basically, the background for those who haven't read the blog was that in 2014 we switched from streams to tracks basically, and it used to be on add stream and on remove stream, and we switched over to a track event. But instead of having a track removed event at that time, we said no, we don't need that because we're now firing ended on the track. So that has been in the spec in some form, including this leftover text ever since. So when transceivers got added, I don't know how others, but personally, I was actually confused for a long time. I didn't realize that the early media meant that you wouldn't get remote signaling in the form of the ended event anymore. So unfortunately, that leftover text has lingered for a long time, and I'm wondering if that somehow undermines consensus, because if people see text in the spec that reaffirms their own view of things, then they say, "Oh, that looks great. Okay, I don't have to read any further." So,
well, the text also had a lot of references to the term stopped, which turned out to be very confused because sometimes it meant a direction change and sometimes it meant stop sending.
right.
So it was a pretty big mess.
Right. So I also see my issue file. Is this one? Do we want to talk about all the issues around this at once, or because there's one issue is proposed is to add back the ended event the way implementations work now, basically, so that, as I understand it, and let me know if I'm jumping ahead, that would mean that if you set direction on the remote end, if you set direction in a way that causes the track to stop, your remote track to stop receiving, basically, then an ended event would be fired on the track. And basically later, if that direction resumes so you get start receiving again, a new track event would fire that would either have the same track ID or a different track ID up to decision. And in that case, basically would preserve the idea that this was a new track now, and that the receiver track attribute would be nullable and be null in that interim.
So just a clarifying question here. It's not clear to me, and maybe you were just getting at this, Janabar, is that when we change direction, or when we set a given track to be, only flowing one way for a little while, and then it's going to go back to two-way or something like that.
Right.
I think it'd be nice for applications to get information about that happening in some sort of relatively easy way. But I think I would tend to view it as an attribute on the track, and not that we destroy the track and create a new track every time the direction changes.
Right. I guess the question is how much web compatibility. Go ahead.
Well, it is right now in the sense, Cullen, that when you stop sending, you do get a muted event, right? So, and that is an attribute of the track.
Right.
But it's different from ended. So for example, if you do replace track with null, then that will result in muted on the other side. But at least transceiver.stop results in ended because it's permanent. You can't restart the receivers or the senders. And so on the other side, you get ended. So that's at least one distinction right now, is that, at least in some of the spec, it may not be consistent, is that ended is kind of for permanent things and muted is for when you stop sending. Like replace track null will result in muted, not ended.
So that makes perfect sense as a way to do it. That sounds good to me. I think the spec's a little bit inconsistent on that, but we could make it consistent with that view.
The problem, though, with the muted event is that the muted event can fire for many reasons. It's from the media capture spec and says that the user agent basically can call it at any time. There are also over-constrained events in the media user spec that would also call it. So there's not much that can be inferred from. It would be wrong for an application, I think, to do unmuted and infer that, oh, the track has been removed now. So,
but can't the app just check the transceiver direction if it wants to know?
Yes, that's true. I think what this comes down to is if we want to preserve, we still have add track and remove track in the spec, and in addition to add transceiver, and they're almost the same, but they differ in how you approach the same problem. So for people who use add track and remove track, do we want to preserve the existing expectations that when you remove a track, it actually ends remotely, but also gets removed from the stream? That's the other thing I want to talk about is add track introduces stream relationships to tracks. And so remove track presumably removes those again. And that should hopefully be reflected remotely that a track that got removed from the stream and the peer connection would then be removed remotely and ended. Both ended and removed from the remote stream. Does that make sense?
Why does that matter? Why does it matter if a dead track is still in the stream or not?
Well, imagine what happens if you use add track and remove track over and over. These dead tracks are going to accumulate in your remote stream, and your HTML element is going to be very confused, I think.
I mean, I remember writing some of this text when writing the initial PR for add track, and I remember thinking that it didn't make sense to have a track removed event because I couldn't think of any way how that would be different than ended.
Right.
Okay, but
now,
in this case, it's not being removed or ended.
Well,
so I mean, like, we tried very hard when we introduced, the early media and transceiver APIs to make add track work like it did before, and that's why there's a bunch of special case logic where we have to say, try to match, the track to an existing transceiver according to these rules, and when saying a remote description, match with transceivers created by add track, especially, et cetera. So, if we went to that effort, it doesn't make sense that we would just forget about remove track, keeping the same behavior.
Well, I'm not sure what you're suggesting. I mean, I guess on the ended, you could just have ended tracks fall out of the containing stream.
Well, before we talk about ending tracks falling out of the stream, right now they're not even being ended. That's the issue we're talking about first.
Right.
Yeah. Well, replace track doesn't end the receiving stream either. The receiving track either, right? It just.
So I think what I'm proposing is basically that I would like to know what the use case is of. I'm sorry, let me back up. So people who don't want this behavior can already use replace track, and there's no renegotiation. And even if renegotiation happens after you use replace track, say you want to temporarily stop sending this video, you do replace track null. There's no renegotiation needed to do that. The sender just stops sending. So presumably, I forget if you get black on the other side in that case, but it should probably. And then later, if you want to turn the video back on, you replace track back in the video. So it seems like users who want that behavior can just use replace track. So I'm curious about the difference between that and, in addition to replace track null, also setting the direction to reflect that we're not sending. What's the benefit?
But what happens when somebody calls set direction to inactive?
Right. In that case, the remote track would end, and the receiver track would.
But then how do they set the direction back to active?
They set it back to active, and they renegotiate, and then you would get a new track event fired remotely. and receiver track would
So
be a separate get.
that's the part that I think is a can of worms that I'm not interested in opening.
Like if someone's using the transceiver and set direction APIs, and they don't need to be listening to the track events, in the first place, they can write their code entirely in transceiver-based way. So, I mean, this is mainly about compatibility with people who have, used the track-based model.
No, what I'm saying is, I think allowing the RTP receiver to have different tracks at different times is opening a can of worms that we're going to have to go chase down a whole bunch of edge cases around that. And I don't think it's worth going after that in order to get the margin we might get here.
I agree. I think that the way Bernard phrased it as the set direction are effectively temporary events, and then there's final events. And for the temporary events, I don't want the objects disappearing and reappearing. For the final sort of events, sure, it's fine if they disappear.
Well,
but there's no way in the SIGME to distinguish between the temporary ones and the permanent one.
Sorry, can you?
Well, permanent ones cause.
Permanent ones cause inline equals 0. Temporary ones have set the direction attribute.
Right.
Well, then you're suggesting that remove track zeroes out an inline.
Not currently. It doesn't. It just stops. It just stops sending, and you get muted on the other side.
Isn't transceiver stop necessary to zero out an inline?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, the question is, what should remove track do? Should remove track? Well, it can't, because then you stop in both directions.
Yeah, remove track today just stops sending. It isn't permanent. You can call replace track and replace it.
Transceiver stop is not a solution because that stops in both directions. So.
Well, if remove track isn't permanent, then we can't have it fire ended.
Right.
On the track.
That's why it shouldn't fire ended right today.
Well,
okay, so here's my counter proposal.
It can't fire ended unless an RTP receiver can have multiple tracks. That's a suggestion.
Right.
Which I'm not okay with.
Why though? Can you?
Because it's gonna. We've contemplated this idea before, and it opens up a lot of other edge cases.
It would introduce.
I would say the
worms are changed.
Okay, the worms
so
are
here's
in
my
the can here. The worms are in the other can here because this is actually bringing us closer to existing behavior. So there's more implementations of current behavior than of this new transceiver behavior. So we're going to break a lot of people.
There's only one implementation of the current.
No, both Chrome and Firefox behave more in this way.
Yes.
Even with Chrome and Unified Plan STP, if you remove a track on one side, it gets removed on the other side.
Well, here's my counter proposal. My counter proposal is that we stick with muted, and if an application cares whether it was for remove track or not, it can check the direction of the transceiver.
But the issue is about backwards compatibility, right? Well, we want applications that are currently track or stream-based to keep working.
Right. I don't see how we can break all existing users of add stream and remove stream on the remote end. Basically, it's calling a remove stream and remove track we're talking about.
So in what way are they going to break?
And that if you call remove stream or remove track.
Is this a theoretical problem where we just guess that there are users out there, or do we know that there are actual applications that are going to break in a bad way if this doesn't fire the way they expect?
Well, you're saying no one uses a remove stream or a remove track?
I think there's burden of proof necessary to say that not firing the ended event on the remote side when the sending side calls remove track actually will break anything.
Well, the burden of proof might also be on foot here, in that if we're going to break backwards compatibility, we should make sure usage is low enough to do that. Right? So I was interested in the set direction. What's the use case where you would need to renegotiate and set direction temporarily to inactive for that direction, if you will, or receive only. What's the use case there that would be broken by this? Because if you don't set direction, you get to keep your track, and transceivers work fine.
I mean, you're asking me what the use case of set direction is? I mean, I'm not the one that pushed for adding set direction.
So that was the issue you had. If you call set direction inactive, then the track, and then back to send receive, the track goes away. And there's a new track.
So basically, all these hold scenarios.
I'm convinced that if we change the rule that an RTP receiver can have different tracks at different times, we're going to be chasing down all kinds of new edge cases and weird scenarios. And so we'd be playing whack-a-mole where we stick one edge case down and a whole bunch of them pop up.
Well,
yeah, I'm concerned about that too.
Edge case. This is about having changing the model for what a remote track represents. And once we do that, I'm sure there are going to be issues in spec to resolve, but it's
So I like to think that the worms are on the other side here, because when we switched from streams to add to tracks, part of the reason for that was to untangle tracks as a control surface to the sender, and we had sender and receiver objects instead, and those represented the sending point and the recipient point for the connection. So tracks are no longer tracks are the result and the source of peer connection. So what's the point? I would ask, what's the point of having a receiver object and a track if they're one-to-one? I mean, they don't need to be one-to-one. That's why we have receiver.track. So, and it seems more symmetrical to me that you'd be able to add and remove different tracks that may or may not go through the same sender, and you'll receive one or more tracks from the the same receiver.
What you're proposing is a major change, and we're going to be chasing down the implications of that change for a very long time. I absolutely do not think it's. I don't think it's worth it.
What we have in spec right now is a major change for what's implemented, right? And this a smaller dip. That's the argument.
We're reducing the change here in the spec.
I'm not convinced that people are actually going to be broken by this. It seems like a very minor thing that the vast majority apps are not going to notice.
Jan-Ivar, I was thinking, if you initially only set up sending media, you have an RTP receiver with a track already that is muted. So going back to muted would actually, let's say that then after a while you start receiving and that track goes unmuted, and then if you stop receiving, is it that bad that it goes back to kind of the state that it was when you weren't receiving? So I kind of agree with you that it's a bit strange that we have a receiver and track and they're extremely tied to each other. But I think we're already down that road when we have the initial track that's muted.
Yes, I understand what you mean, but the muted track is a red herring, because the muted, it can go on and off all the time. Specifically for a browser can implement a privacy shield, for instance, that would let the end user mute something, and that it would fire in that case, and also over constrained events. So for a receive track to use the muted case, the problem though, I think, is if you're.
I agree that's not ideal with.
If you're adding tracks, then and you have a remote stream that you've attached to, say, you're playing it back in a media element or whatever, then those tracks get added to that stream. If you remove them, we're now no longer removing them from the stream, right? And they stick around. So you have all these, they're not even dead, they're these ghost tracks that are, as far as I have tested, if you do that to a media element, at least in two browsers, it's sort of a luck of the draw if it ends up playing the right one. So I would ask, how is an app supposed to detect removal of tracks today? I mean, when we break this, there's no ready way to do that today, to write code JavaScript today that will not break in the future.
If an application wants to make it clear that an entire transceiver is stopped, then it can stop the transceiver.
Well, that's a no-go, because that would stop in both directions, which doesn't solve that's like
There's no way in the SDP, which is at the bottom, the state we're dealing with, to represent the fact that you have a permanent unidirectional won't send anymore.
Right. I agree.
Every other time we've discussed this, we've come out to the use cases for that is that's not a big deal. That, like, yes, you can stop it in both directions when you need to, and you can pause it one direction. I'm using pause and stop sort of loosely here, right?
Good. Well, in that case, replace track without renegotiation should be sufficient, I think, for pause.
Replace track. No, that keeps sending. So understand that there's a couple things that's happening. One is controlling whether black's sent or not, but the other thing is about bandwidth usage, whether you're continuing to send the packets or not. So you need some way to stop the packets from being sent too.
At least in Firefox, if you pause, even if you do track enable false in Firefox, it reverts to sending 1 black frame per second. Is that not sufficient? And I don't even know how we would implement replace track null. Maybe that would be more severe.
I mean, if we set the SDP to say only send data one direction, you shouldn't be sending even 1 black frame per second, right?
We're talking different things now. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. I think I'm a little bit lost on that then.
Right. I'm saying you don't need set direction to implement hold. You can just do replace track null.
Because replace track null keeps sending data. Set direction one way stops sending data.
Okay. Well, at least in Firefox, it quite reduces the number of bits that are sent already.
That's great, but that doesn't matter, right? The problem is like, well, to work, it needs to stop sending bits, not reduce the number of bits it sends.
Okay. So if you want to, so that's not pause to me. That sounds like, so you want to totally stop. And then in that case, this would then, you would need to listen to, you would end it, well, you could listen to end, and you would get a new track event when it resumes later.
I'm listening now and trying to make some notes, but I think I hear support for not changing the spec actually now from the majority of people, and I guess someone has said that if we could get some data, we could reconsider. So is there a way to add counters or something to see if this is an actual problem or just an edge case?
Well, those of us in favor of what you call not changing the spec, actually, we do need to remove the section 5.1 firing ended.
Yeah, correct. But I was meaning that if we keep muted as the event fired.
Right.
I just want to point out with muted, I don't think that fires immediately when saying a remote description with a new direction attribute, does it? I thought that only happens after.
Well, it'll fire with a delay, right? Because basically the SSOC has to be taken out, and where the by received or whatever, and then it fires.
This is different than an application listening for the ended event and saying, oh, when the other peer decides to remove their video track, I'm going to invoke this application level logic.
Well, remember though, even for the case of ended, right? Even for the case of ended in the transceiver.stop, you still need to set the remote description before that'll fire.
Mm-hmm.
So muted does fire because of media, the buy and stuff.
So are applications expected to listen to muted then and then remove the track from the remote stream themselves? if they want that behavior from remove track to be the way it used to be. I mean, that doesn't sound.
I think so, because nothing else seems to happen automatically.
I don't think you can overload muted for this. I think if you're doing anything, it should be that you check the direction after set remote description finishes. But the question is, whether we need to handle your backwards compatibility here or not. That seems like the main question to me. Well, and some people are, Peter are saying we don't think people are using the ended event, and it's okay if it stops working like that.
Well, I mean, that it seems that would be true if all people ever did was to add tracks to a connection.
Or they remove them, but they don't check. They just don't listen to the ended event.
Right, and then.
I think actually there are very few apps that actually remove tracks. I think it's probably going to be very few. I think most of them just add them and then close the peer connection when they're done. And then out of the ones that do remove track, I think very few are going to have any logic based on what the remote set, based on listening to the ended event, or rather the ended state.
It still seems confusing to me, though, even for our new users, that removing a track from a sender does not, in fact, remove the remote track from the stream, since add track was the one that bound that track to the stream. So there's a very asymmetrical, confusing API, I think. You can add things, but you can never remove them from the remote stream.
Well, tell people not to use add track and remove track. They are confusing, well, I will agree.
We should have decided that, a year ago, or when we were kind of with all the crazy ways to make add track continue to work. But if we decided that add track, remove track should continue to work, then we should, actually make it work and not just half. And I don't think it's safe to assume that applications just don't remove tracks today. I mean,
I didn't say that I didn't say that no one's removing tracks. But I think we'd be pretty safe in assuming that no one's listening to the sended event.
I don't agree.
But that brings us back to my question, is there a way to add counters and return to this later? Because now we're speculating to what extent this is a problem.
Well, I think I would have to leave.
We remove the tracks on some of our stuff, but I mean, we're talking, like the applications that do this are so complicated and fairly advanced WebRTC users that are really doing this type of stuff that no matter what you do to the spec, as long as you do something logical and reasonable, like we don't care if it breaks our current app, it just doesn't matter. Right.
Well, I think the spec the way it is now, we did not say that add track and remove track is legacy, right? So I understand the viewpoint that everyone should use add transceiver and understand that model, but that's not what we've done in the spec. We kept add track and remove track in there, and it is a leaky abstraction of sorts. However, for basic expectations, having a remove track not remove the track in the remote stream when it does that in all the applications today, at least 2 implementations.
Now, hold on. To be clear, like we're talking about the ended event, not removing the track from the remote stream. We decided not to modify the remote stream like way back when we first decided to move from add stream to add track. I don't even think that's on the table at all. The question is just whether the remote track changes its state, not whether it gets removed from the remote stream.
When tracks are added, they're added to the stream right now.
Yes, but not removed after they're first added. That was like something we decided a very long time ago. That only that initial state was going to be propagated, and that future changes to the stream were not going to be propagated.
Well, if you could, it would help if you could find language for me, if you wouldn't mind.
Sorry, what?
That was decided. If you could find where that I would love to know when that changed, because I don't see a clear discussion. I may have missed it. But that is how implementations work today, at least Chrome.
Well,
So
I mean,
it would be breaking.
Chrome has not moved over to add and remove track yet. We're still in add and remove stream, so it makes no sense to say, well, Chrome does it this way, so we should keep doing it that way. We need to change the API we have in Chrome completely. So saying we should continue what Chrome does has no bearing in this regard.
Presumably, some users are using Adapter.js with Chrome to have behavior that's more similar to the spec, at least. A newer iteration of the spec.
Yeah, and there's a parallel between Chrome's, add stream, remove stream, and add stream methods and add stream, remove stream events to add track and track events that that easily polyfilled, but if the model is fundamentally different, it can't be.
We've been pretty insistent that add stream be polyfilled exactly like stream get tracks for each track, add track stream. So that is an existing, understood interpretation of the gap right now between the implementations and the spec. So even Chrome with Adapter.js will, if you add stream, will fire the track event and will fire the ended event as was written in the spec, at least in 2015.
So getting back to Stefan's point, do we understand the next steps?
Well,
I can say I don't. I'm lost on this conversation. What's the outcome?
Yeah, I'd say the same thing, but I was hoping for more clarity than that.
Right. Well, to me, I would predict significant breakage. So if there's a way to find numbers,
okay.
There may be people at Google, I'm thinking of, that might be able to get, has been, in the past we've gotten good usage information, will help from Google.
We don't even have
sorry?
We don't even have a remove track method, so we can't.
Well, the equivalent would be people listening for their remove stream event.
Yeah. So usage of remove stream would be useful. Unfortunately, Mozilla's telemetry requires a lot of lead time. We have to ask all our questions ahead and put them in. So it would take a while to get answers that way. If there was a way to scan HTTP archive, that might be more fruitful. I know Fulip has done good work there in detecting usage.
So it seems to me that for the Chrome data, you could probably generate it just by generating analytics out of adapter.js with no changes to anything. Would that work? Is that possible?
I don't think that covers enough usage, though.
I mean, how do we differentiate between, an ended event firing and, that ended event being used by the application? That's a little harder, but.
I guess I don't understand. Sorry if this is backtracking, but when you use set direction in this manner, what's the problem with getting a new track? Where does that break down for people?
I really don't want to go down that path. Like, it's just there's going to be too many edge cases. So here's one last shot. Here's one last shot at a crazy idea before we give up and go gather telemetry or whatever. Would this be too crazy? The first time that the M-line goes inactive, either because of remote track or set direction, the track gets removed from the remote stream, but it does not fire the ended event. It goes to muted and then back from muted. It never gets re-added to the stream, but it gets removed. It gets removed from the stream if the inline direction indicates that it's inactive.
So
No, I don't think I'm very keen on that, because that means that when it goes out of inactive, then a new and different thing gets generated, right? Different object gets generated.
No. I'm saying the tracks is the same for the receiver. The receiver never changes tracks, but the track gets removed from the stream that it was originally put in.
Right.
You could see that it got removed from the stream. That only happens once, but the ended state does not get fired.
And then if it got put back to active, then it would get moved back inside of the stream?
No. This is like a one-time, it gets removed from the stream once, it never gets added back.
Why just one time?
Because it's just trying to reflect the fact that you called remove track. Now, it has the oddity that when you call set direction inactive, it also removes it from the stream, but it's probably something that no one would ever notice.
Well, why would we have it only work for the first cycle of add track and move track?
Right.
Well, fine. I guess if we're calling add track again and it gets added again, then if you call remove track again, it would get removed again.
Right.
But I'm saying that shouldn't be determined by set direction. If you called set direction active, I wouldn't expect it to go back in. But if that does happen and that's what we want to write in the text, maybe that's not too crazy. I'm just saying instead of firing the ended event,
Right.
we use the state of the track in the stream as indicating that, as being tied to the inactivity in a way.
That could work. At least that would give
Optimize the
users
training.
that would allow people.
Because my big thing is I don't want to fire the end event, but if you want to do some trickery with tracks inside of streams, I think I'm okay with that.
Okay, well, I thought you didn't want just because of the complexity you introduced the spec, but what
No,
you're
no.
suggesting that I think would introduce the same amount of complexity, you just want to resolve in the end. Oh, no, but
I think this is much less
you
complicated.
still have a one-to-one relationship between the receiver and the track, I guess.
Yes, exactly.
I actually, yeah, go ahead.
But now I have a proposal, initial proposal on the table. Who can work on this?
Oh, we have the other proposals as well, still.
I think Stefan wants to know who's going to take the ball from here.
Yeah.
Is
Right.
it something we think we can all live with?
Is it going to result in submission of a PR and review and?
Sure, I could try to do that, or Taylor, if you want.
Peter.
Peter. I mean, what I like about it, I don't like the only one part, but it would, if we did that continuously and had that be the model, because it's important to understand, if there was a way to distinguish add track and remove track from set direction, we could solve this better, right? But there isn't. So if that is the behavior, at least would let people write JavaScript today, and they would change their code now. They have a lead time to change if they are looking for ended. They may already be looking for remove, a stream removed, on removed, and stuff like that. So that would give a bridge way, and so I like that idea. And also I think it would work with early media, because in early media, the API already forces you, because you just get the track early, you don't get the stream early. So in that case, early media users will already have put that track away in a new media stream. So I like that part because they're not broken at all. They won't be removed from that stream. So their usage can coexist with more legacy type users of the receiver control stream. If that makes sense.
This is Shijun. I have a question here. So if we do that on the media stream object, we're going to see the add track and the remove track event, right?
Right.
Right. I think that's more consistent with the get user media spec, actually.
Yes, and existing implementations.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And it's also more consistent with this initial muted track that's not in any streams before you even start receiving.
Right. Okay, so I think we have a way forward with this one.
Okay, but before we move on, I just want to point out, a couple of problems with that, or that it assumes that the legacy applications would be doing this port are looking for the stream track removed event and not just looking for the track ended event. And this would only work if you actually have streams and not if you're using a track without any streams.
Right. Yep.
So it kind of only solves the problem for some people. And I'm not sure if that's worth doing anything. I feel like we should just do all or nothing. do anything.
Tracks being in a stream mean they're synchronized, right? Like that's and when you start moving them out and then they don't move back in, like that's a problem. I mean,
Well, in practice, I don't think the remote stream relationship. I mean, you could take an early media stream track. Presumably, you can get early media for both audio and video, right? And you're not gonna have access to the stream yet because the track event hasn't even fired. So presumably, those two things, the implementation still knows to keep those in sync, even if the JavaScript hasn't. It's not like things go out of sync the second you move a track from one stream to another. So I think that streams at this point are just more organizing tools for the app rather than a control surface for syncing. Is that true?
Yeah.
I would agree that matches current implementations, but at the point we want to do syncing, they're going to turn into more than a useless organizational concept, right? They're going to turn into the way we control synchronization.
Well, just to address that briefly, it might work, the idea that when you set the direction back to active, it does add it back to the stream. And so it's sort of like goes in, out every time you change the direction.
Right. I think it would need to do something like that for it to work. That would make sense to me.
And I'll note, we actually are, running the syncing off the streams. So the things, especially if the jitter buffers start to drift around, you can lose your sync if it may be limits on how far it's going to go off, but still you can lose your sync if they're not in the same stream.
Randall, I think we also have an internal representation of a stream that doesn't match the DOM version, though, right?
That may be true. So it could be that it's that, but the spec doesn't know about that.
Right.
To get the notes right, Peter, was the proposal that the track would come and go as a result of changing the direction, or as a result of add and remove track, or both?
Well, it has to be both because the remote side can't tell the difference.
That matches my understanding.
Right.
I mean, well, never mind. I was gonna say it could tell the difference by if we say that the MSID attribute being present depends on whether you call it remove track or just set direction, but that would require changes to JSON.
So I like
require changes to JSON is a very scary phrase right now.
But I have recorded an action on you, Jan-Ivar, to work a bit more on Peter's idea. We can revisit it when we've done that.
So my view is that I think that's a good idea anyway for backwards compatibility. So not to be greedy, but I think there's still some use in maybe discussing having that and still firing ended, if there are other proposals that were on the slides.
I agree.
So sorry, I missed that. What did you say?
Well, I agree that PR, I'm not sure. I think that PR is a good idea. I think it's an improvement on compatibility part of the spec. I would still like to talk about ended.
Mm-hmm.
It may be that PR is enough, or it may be that we need that PR and solve ended, depending on the numbers we get from ended usage.
Okay, I'll record another action on developers to see if they can add counters or something, so we get the statistics.
Great, thanks.
So can we move to Taylor's second slide?
Okay, this one is slightly smaller scope. So I don't remember if we already had this discussion, but basically an issue I noticed is that setting a remote description would discard any codec reordering application previously did with set parameters. So there'd be some time in between when set remote description is called and the implementations switches to the new codec that's on the top of the list to when the application could call set parameters to set it back to the codec it wants to use. And I just imagine this could cause issues because the browser would have to start encoding using the code from the remote description and immediately go back to the code it was using before, and it seems like this could cause some discontinuity just as a result of having to do that when it doesn't really need to.
So, just trying to clarify here. So, if set remote and set parameters happened in, I'm wondering if you were trying to write your app to minimize this delay, can you basically make this delay not like this window non-existent, as long as you write your app the right way?
And since
or is there always a window?
Changing what codec is being sent, happens in parallel steps. There's no guarantee that can be provided.
So hold on, what does it have to do with set parameters? Isn't it set codec preferences that
No, that's about preferences for what codec's being received. I'm talking about RTP sender.set parameters changing which codec is sent. So if the browser's preferred default, or never mind, sorry, the remote endpoint's preferred default is codec A, and you receive the initial remote offer, you call set parameters to change it to B, and then set the answer.
Oh, right, yeah.
And then later you do another offer answer exchange, and the answer has codec A on top. Then it switches back to A. You have to quickly reset parameters again to change it back to B.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. I was confused. Thanks. Swap it back to my memory.
I'm wondering if you always did the set parameters. Let's say you did the set remote, and before you return to a stable state, you always also do the set parameters. I'm not sure that's possible, but if we wrote it, if we said if you did that, would there be no window here? I guess is the question. Could we write the text?
Well, if it's a local offer and a remote answer, then you don't.
Yeah, exactly. That's the issue. If it's a remote offer, then nothing happens until you apply the answer, so you have some time. But if it's local offer, remote answer, then there's no window. And I don't believe any browser has implemented the codec. Well, I know Chrome hasn't. I looked at Firefox recently, and I don't think anyone's implemented the codec reordering as is currently specified. So I don't think it's too late to introduce a change to how the set parameters is allowed to change codecs. And WebRTC has a codec payload type field in the encoding parameters. So basically, you use the payload type to point to one of the codecs. And if we use that, then basically we could just say that as long as the previously selected codec is still in the list, in the new remote description, it stays as a selected one. And the list of codecs could always just be static and represent the full set of codecs available in the reference order.
I guess that makes me wonder if we want to do something like that, whether we should just have a way of saying the application to say its preference list is ABC, regardless of what's negotiated. And if C and B get negotiated, then it will pick the highest one in the application preference list that was negotiated. Right? Is that sort of the scheme we eventually end up with? Or
doesn't set codec preferences already do that?
Well, no. Set codec preferences is only what codecs are offered, which
Yeah, so the issue here, and this goes back to when we first added the codecs to set parameters. The issue here is when you get the remote description, it's basically the remote side saying to you, please send this codec. And then the application is calling set parameters to say explicitly, no, I don't care what you asked for, I'm going to send what I want. So the set codec preferences is for what we generate in our own offer or answer that we're going to send to the other side. But this is a question of whether we override, when we override the remote preference for what we send it.
Yeah, but if you didn't want to do what the remote description says, you can just modify the remote description before applying it.
That's true.
That's then saying that we require STP munging for the standard use case, which is what we had introduced as API to avoid. You already could do that before, you know. Introduce set parameters, you know, allowing codec reorient so that you don't have to do that.
So back when we discussed this a long time ago when we first added the codecs to set parameters, I was in favor of not having set remote description kind of blow away set parameters like that. But I do recall others being in favor of it blowing it away. So on one hand, I would say, yeah, sure, let's not blow it away. But on the other hand, that's basically me taking the position I had before without the people who had the other side before either being here or remembering it.
I don't see any problem with saying, you know, there's a codec payload type field on encoding parameters. If it's unset, the browser uses the, you know, remote endpoint preferred codec. If it's set, it uses the one selected by the application. And, you know, it's the application's responsibility to, you know, change that and as new remote descriptions arrive and the set of codecs changes. Like if an application is using this API, you know, they can be assumed to know what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, just my recollection of why we argued for blowing it away every time you got a new offer answer was that what you had there before might not be consistent with the current offer answer. And it just became really complicated to try and figure out how you spec'd or wrote, like, you know, take your old preferences, or at least the ones that make sense out of your older preferences, and apply them to the new thing. It just became confusing.
When is that a problem? What's an example?
Well,
I think
if we offered codec A and B and said we preferred codec B, and then the next round of negotiation offered codecs D and E, but you still say you have your codec B, I mean, that's the sort of case I'm talking about. I'm not saying we couldn't solve this case. We probably could write something that would work here. I just don't. I seem to recall that was the reason against it.
If that's the only reason against it, I would say that could be solved easier by just saying, you know, it goes back to being unset and using the default preference, and the application should decide again whether it wants to use D or E, but it shouldn't, you know, break the case where AB goes to AB or AB goes to ABC, and, you know, the application can choose to switch to C if it wants, or it can choose not to.
I'm just wondering.
I think one way forward might be if you were able to write a paragraph that expressed that in a way that covers this case, and then, you know, propose that as a solution and see if we are happy with it. because I think if you could write a paragraph for PR, for example, that covers what Colin is suggesting in a simple way, that doesn't introduce too much complexity, then I think that would be a good solution, in my opinion. What do you think, Colin?
Colin is nodding.
Oh, all right.
I was muted and talking to myself. If we had a paragraph like that, sounds good. We could get all the people who aren't on this call right now who might also have strong opinions about this to review it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does someone take on the action to write that text?
Yes, I can.
Can I first ask a question?
Sure.
Is this specifically for codecs, or does this need to be solved on a broader scale? Because set parameters and set remote description can and will cause all kind of conflicts. The one example I can bring, which we're fighting right now, is basically RIDs. You can easily create all kind of weird scenarios where like set parameter says like I want these 3 RDs, and then the set remote description doesn't match the thing, and you will have to figure out what you do about it. Either you take like the minimum subset, or you throw an error, or something along these lines. But basically, the whole set parameters thing can cause all kind of negotiation failures or negotiation problems, where like what got fed in via set parameters will not be the end result. I was just wanted to check if you guys are like just trying to tackle like specifically the codec problem only, or maybe this is a bigger problem. I'm not sure.
I think the trauma you're describing is somewhat independent. I mean, there are encoding parameters that are completely independent from SCP. And certainly this is, this kind of issue affects anything where the parameters can come both from SDP and the application. But I would have to think through the simulcast cases separately.
This is Jan over here, not my area, but it seems like the spec says of RID that it's not modifiable via set parameters. It can only be set and modified by a receiver.
Yeah, so it can only affect things that are modifiable.
Okay, then we got that sorted out. But Taylor, you took the action to propose some text.
Yeah.
I had a side question there. That someone mentioned the SDP is not modifiable, and I see there's a language in the spec that to throw invalid modification error. I assume that can only apply to local descriptions, though, since how would you know if someone modified the remote SDP?
Yeah. Right. It's only about set local.
Right. Thanks.
I think there's a PR in review right now that makes the invalid modification error more explicit. Should address that.
Great, thanks.
All right, so this is an issue I think was brought by a couple people in review, and maybe everyone wasn't aware of this behavior, but each data channel has some form of buffer, and when this buffer is whole and send is called, the data channel is closed abruptly, not following SCP closing procedure, and the application can't send any data anymore with it. And this was done to match WebSockets, and I tried to do some digging into why this decision was made for WebSockets, and the explanation, as far as I understand it, is that if they had decided to throw an exception when this condition occurred, they were worried that the application might just ignore the exception and then continue trying to send data, and as a result, you have one message that didn't get sent and another message that do get sent successfully, and you just have this gap in the stream as a result. Whereas if sending multiple buffers will just close the connection, that's not a problem. And there's also the reasoning that applications will be expecting the connections to close sometimes anyway, and they should have code to recover from this. But that last part of the reasoning doesn't apply to WebRTC data channels, I believe, because a WebRTC data channel isn't going to be closed normally as a result of an STTP timeout, because an ICE restart typically would have restored connectivity before that happens. So I don't think WebRTC users are writing code that expects data channels to get closed randomly, and as a result, anytime someone does hit this, they're surprised. So I would propose that we diverge from WebSockets here, and we already do in some other places, so it wouldn't be the first time, and just throw an exception when send is called in this state. And in effect, we would, the data channel would behave like a non-blocking socket then, where you can just keep sending until it starts applying back pressure, and then wait for the buffer mount low event.
Yeah, I'm generally okay with this. Your reasoning about the difference in how closes happen and are likely to be expected is probably reasonable. Obviously, applications will make exactly the sort of error that is referred to in the WebSocket side. They will call send, they will not check the result, they will not have an exception handler, and things will get lost. Now, if it's a UDP-like socket, a non-reliable, there's a UDP-like data channel, a non-reliable data channel, that's just fine because you could lose the packet anyways. Okay. However, a lot of the transfers will be on reliable data channels, and yes, you would end up losing them. The application would have to deal with this. Now, they have to deal with it somehow, either by handling a close or by handling the exception. Since they have to have some code to handle it anyways, they normally wouldn't have other code to handle random closes. It's reasonable to say that the code you have to handle this is an exception handler. We might want to make this very obvious somehow, but I don't. Forcing them to have some code to handle the problem is a reasonable thing, or requiring them to have some code to handle the problem is a reasonable thing. It's only a question of what code is that. And WebSockets was relying on the fact they needed the code for something else anyways.
Yeah, and
so Randall, you're arguing we should. You're saying basically we should do what Taylor's proposing here. Is that?
Yes.
Okay, I agree. I mean, the closing without noticing is just everyone I explained that to is you got to be kidding. What were you guys thinking?
I understand WebSocket's thinking. They have to have the other stuff anyway, so you might as well avoid applications making the error of not handling it. But in this case, we don't have that. Any objections?
I hear none, so I think we should ask Taylor to draft a PR, or maybe that's done already.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Okay, so then we will take to the notes that we plan to merge that PR. What's the number of the PR? Do you know it directly? Or otherwise
I can figure out in a couple seconds. Just a second. 1209.
Thank you.
Right, and this next issue isn't an issue if we do that. So we can skip this.
Okay, the next cluster is relating to DTLS certificates and algorithms. The first one is relating to DTLS failures. We talked about it at the last interim, but then we had the issue of how are the DTLS failures fired and so forth. Currently, we have RTC peer connection.on fingerprint failure, which covers fingerprint verification failures, but doesn't cover other DTLS errors. And then we have PR 1115. The proposal in that one is to utilize RTC DTLS transport.on error, so have an on error event handler for the DTLS transport that will cover all DTLS errors. The first step of that is to add a DTLS failure to the RTC error detail type, and that has received alert for an alert that's received and sent alert for a value of DTLS alert sent. I guess another question would be, do we need to add a distinct fingerprint failure to the RTC error detail type? Taylor mentioned that RFC 8122 section 6.2 mandates that both clients and servers terminate with a bad certificate alert on a fingerprint mismatch, but there is some questions about whether implementations are actually doing that, in particular if they treat their SSL implementation like a black box. They may not necessarily handle it at the alert level, but maybe at an upper level. So comments?
I mean, I find so. I'm not sure this changes what we should do at all, but I just like I didn't actually realize that 8122 said that. No one does that. It's nearly impossible to implement.
Yeah,
it's nuts, right? I mean, like, can you imagine? Like, you know, we're trying to mirror what TLS for HTTPS does, and HTTPS most certainly does not send an alert when the CN name doesn't match the name you're expecting or something. So I don't really. I suspect maybe this section 6.2 stuff should get reworked. But
I mean, I think Firefox fires the alert properly, and Chrome doesn't. But I consider that bug. My 2 cents.
I mean, for some TLS stacks, you're going to have to extend the API of the TLS library to be able to do this, right?
Right, like Edge channel can't do this, so we don't do it in Edge, I don't believe.
Yeah, and I think this is nuts.
It can still bar the event at least, even if it doesn't actually send the alert. It can say, oh, it's sent over UDP, so it's lossy, and I didn't manage to send it, but the event being bubbled to JavaScript, we can at least guarantee that.
Well, I mean, that we should map this event of the fingerprint failure up to the JavaScript layer. I'm not arguing that in the slightest, but like the alerts like get delivered reliably, I think, right, in DTLS. So, no, you can't just pretend it got lost, right? And you don't so we're talking about whether we think that
alerts aren't received reliably, as far as I know.
Okay, you could be right. I don't know. That's fascinating in themselves. I mean, if they're not, but I mean, we should either, if we're going to do this as alerts, we really need to do them as alerts, not just like pretend we were sort of doing alerts but not doing them. And I suspect people find it surprisingly difficult to do this as alerts, or to do what 8122 suggests.
I mean, I don't see that, the SSL libraries and browsers are using, doesn't support this as a very good argument, but that's just me.
It'd be interesting to see the TLS working group review the change to TLS that we just made over in MMusic, right? I think that they may have some comments. But ignoring that, I don't think it really changes too much what we need to do, which is, I mean, I see what you're saying is it's what we all sort of agree we need to report this fingerprint failure up. We're just discussing like what container we deliver it in, right?
Right. Well, the other question is, do we want the error on the DTLS transport or on the RTC peer connection? That's the other question.
I mean, this is definitely a DTLS transport, so it seems like that's. I guess so. The argument for not putting it there would really be that for people who aren't using a transport or just using a peer connection.
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know.
Let me put it this way. So currently in the PR, in PR 1105, we do have the fingerprint failure, RTC error detail type. Are there objections to keeping that there? I mean, if an implementation wants to do the bad certificate thing, I guess it will, and it'll come in as an alert. I guess for the reasons Colin said, I just don't think you can depend on it coming in as an alert. Let me put it that way. So I guess what I'm asking here is, are there objections to keeping the PR more or less as it is? Or is there consensus for changing it in some way?
I guess when I really think about it, as long as when writing an application, can clearly figure out what happened, I don't really care what the container is that delivers this at some much. But if I have to start writing complicated code to tear apart alerts to figure out it's a bad certificate, to find out that I had a fingerprint match, or if I don't get the fingerprint match error at all because no one implements the alert for bad certificate, that would make me sad.
Yeah, I guess the concern,
we can require implementations to fire an event with sent alert bad certificate, even if they don't actually implement sending the alert. It's just a matter of what flavor the event comes in. Is it a separate or not? And I don't see why it should be a separate event if it already could be covered by an alert.
Yeah, so I guess we could say that even if you don't, if you don't send the alert, then you wouldn't have the D2S failure with sent alert, right? But
I mean, there's so many things that can cause a bad certificate. So now it means I have to go trolling around in the certificate to figure out why the certificate was bad. Or what do I do next?
Well, that's a better argument then.
Good luck with that. But yeah, you'll just, I mean, well, if you got the alert, you'll get it in received alert. You won't really know why the remote peer felt your certificate was bad. I mean, I'm presuming that probably fingerprint failure is the most likely reason.
Or it didn't like my crypto, or I don't know. Yeah. I guess I need to think about this a little bit.
That seems like argument enough for it to be a separate event. So I'm okay with that reasoning.
Could you repeat that, Taylor?
If the reasoning is that bad certificate is too vague and could have multiple causes for a fingerprint error, you know exactly what it is. I understand that argument.
Mm-hmm.
But Taylor, are you saying PR 1115 is okay, or are you proposing changes?
Well, we may need to clarify some of these distinctions a little bit.
Okay, I'll write that as a conclusion.
Okay. All right. So this one came in from FIPO. It's issue 1250. And he's saying that in WebRTC PC, the DTLS transport doesn't provide a way to obtain the local DTLS certs that the transport was created with. In ORTC, you can get them. Now, in PR 1130, we clarified that RTC configuration.certificate, if it's not specified in the constructor, subsequently get configuration.certificates is undefined. So if you didn't if you didn't specify any certificates, they still get generated, the default certs, but get configuration won't retrieve them. And as a result of that, you can't use get configuration.certificates to retrieve default certificates. So I guess the question for the group is there a need to retrieve default certificates? Because that's, I guess, what FIPO is asking for here. Because you can't do it through get configuration.certs, and I guess he's asking, should you be able to do it using DTLS transport.get certificates? Does the group have an opinion?
What can they be used for?
Well, that's the next, actually the next slide deals with that. The only use case I've heard is like to try to figure out what your default cert type is, like it's RSA or ECDSA. But it's been pointed out that why would you care about that? Because if you wanted to, like say you had a legacy, you had to interoperate with a legacy app that only did RSA, well, just go create an RSA cert all the time. You don't really need to know what your default is. So I guess my answer is I do not have a use case for this. Does anyone else? Can we say there's working group consensus for not doing this?
It sounds like that to me.
Okay. Let's see if we can do one more. Okay. So next one is about get algorithm and relates back to the other one. In issue 496, basically the question was asked how to tell if a cert was RSA or ECDSA, presumably for the default certs. And then as a result, we added get algorithm in PR 499. But subsequently, we realized that without a way to actually retrieve the default certs, you couldn't actually use get algorithm. You could only use it for the application created certs, and presumably you could just store the keygen algorithm used to create those. So it's purely convenience. And so the proposal in PR 1160 is just remove get algorithm. And as far as I know, no one's implemented it.
I think that's fine. I want to just say one thing though about the storing it is keep in mind you're going to have to store it across like starting and stopping the browser and things like that, right? I mean, if you're creating a cert and storing it in an IndexedDB, and you might ever in the future want to know what type it is, you're going to need to also store what type it was, maybe in the same IndexedDB, but somewhere, right? It's not just like you store it in a JavaScript variable,
Yeah.
So,
I mean, there is a convenience to having it, but it's just it is a convenience.
Yeah, so I sort of agree that. I guess the question is this difficult in some way to implement or do? Isn't this just, like, if this was just trivial, it seems like, yes, it's a convenient, but it's a pretty nice convenience.
Well, Taylor, can you summarize Henrik's problems with it?
I'm sorry. I missed some of the context there.
I guess the question is, I think we could live without this, but it seems like it would be really convenient to have it. Is there some reason it's difficult to implement, I think was my question.
Well, if you look in the issue 1159, basically, Henrik has been complaining about it. Both Henrik and Martin were looking at implementing it. I don't think Martin was complaining quite as much, but Henrik was not real happy.
I did look at that, but I didn't understand it, basically. But maybe that's enough for this code.
I think he was... Yeah, one of the questions was whether get algorithm would return exactly the same keygen string as you put in. The answer is no. Yeah, I guess the question is, people, given that it was going to take a fair amount of pain to put in there, the implementers wanted to make sure that people really, really wanted it, because once you put it in and it gets implemented, you can't really take it out. So it's, if people were coming and say, "Oh, I really, really need this," we could certainly put it in later, but. I guess the point is the main use case has now been debunked. Let me ask it, is there anybody who objects to removing it?
I'm in favor of doing less.
So I'll record that we agreed, the meeting attendance agreed to removing it.
Okay. Well, I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, we have, but we made progress. Well, thanks everyone for attending and contributing. I'll send out raw notes right now, and then I guess Vivian will look over them and send out official minutes later on.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.